Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Joanne, for the invitation to speak here today. So I'm presenting this on behalf of the Consumer Insights team, which includes myself, Sarah Jager from Plant and Food Research, Denise Conroy from the University of Auckland, Andrew Zhu from Trace Research, Bill K. Blake from PricewaterhouseCoopers, Miranda Morosa and Phil Bremner from the University of Auckland. So we've deliberately put together a team that actually involves people that are part of the teaching of food science and teaching of food marketing, as well as some of our capabilities that are more broad than that. And I guess when we go in that space, we see, when we think of Asia, we see that there's an obvious target, and there's a target in China specifically. So we can see there's an enormous growth in the affluence of the consumer class in China, and perhaps even more specifically than that, there's a real interest and a willingness to spend some of that income on food, much more than in a lot of our Western markets. It's obviously a reason where a lot of the people in this room are here today. There's an enormous opportunity there. So what I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to talk about some of the work that we've done to date. So we've gone out and we've interviewed some of the New Zealand food and beverage companies. We didn't want to start consumer insights work just blindly without knowing what was already known by industry and what they thought they needed to know. And so this was a pretty core part of the work that we've done up to date. We also wanted to summarize and understand some of the recent consumer science projects that are ongoing in New Zealand across all the various research organisations, universities and Crown Research Institutes. And also we wanted to go and look at the Chinese language science literature in terms of what Chinese scientists are doing in China around understanding those consumers. And of course, you know, we went out and we talked to 12 companies. We talked to staff that were in Asia. We went out to the companies in New Zealand as well. The companies in terms of turnover were between about 70 million and over 1 billion, so these were significant companies from a New Zealand perspective. We talked to marketing people in the market and in New Zealand and some of their senior technical people. And of course, you can imagine that all of those conversations, it's almost impossible for me to summarize what those conversations were in 15 minutes. But what I do want to say, and is really quite important to me, was that gave the Science Challenge an enormous step forward in terms of understanding where we had to go, where we already currently were. And to me, it's that second bullet point. These are people that are in the market day to day, looking from their own product perspective of what they're competing with, what they opportunities are for them, and having an enormous practical experience, intuition, and ability to condense information from a wide range of sources into what it means for those companies. And that's what's been really important for us in gathering that information together. And, you know, to me, one of the really useful things was the question of who are our consumers, and particular in terms of China. And that first point, you know, they have a strong interest in health and the health of their family. I think nobody that's actually looked at any literature would have thought anything other than that for the last 20 years. You look at the European literature, you look at what's happening around. And the next point is that they've experienced an event or reached a life stage that changes, you know, triggers a change and a want to change their diet. And again, you know, we've often worried as we work, particularly with some of the foods in the health halo, that actually we're targeting an aging population. For me, the real insight and one of the most important things that came from those conversations, and I think that it's something that we've always known, is that actually as a New Zealand producer, we're only ever going to produce something that's relevant for and fill the needs of quite a small proportion of consumers, and we want to get a very high price from that. And so, you know, that third bullet point, they're younger, they've travelled, they have some sort of a link with New Zealand and a trust in that. They think that it's cool to eat the way that Western people eat, and they're more willing to spend their money on branded foods. So those are some of the things that are perhaps unique about those consumers in those markets that say actually they're going to buy our very high value products. And they're responding to food trends. And there's some conversations that again were very important to me, that they were looking at the trends from Europe and the USA, and they were looking at organic foods and thinking that was important, and they were picking up on GM type of issues and drawing those from Europe. But also they're looking to other parts of Asia. They're looking particularly towards Japan and Korea in terms of looking for people that look the same as them and eat the same sort of foods as they do, to actually understand what are the new trends that are going to be relevant to them. One of the other things that was really important that came out in those conversations is the role of social media and online sales. And it's probably no surprise, you know, I think sitting here and talking, I'm probably almost teaching you to suck eggs, because this is really what you already know. So when you look at that and you look at the social media and online sales, I think we can look at it from the perspective of the consumers, the companies, and consumer research. And from the consumers, we know that almost an extra 25% people in the last 10 years are starting to look online before they make a purchase to compare prices. That's really an important change in China. It was pretty high to start with. From companies, we know that, you know, some interesting facts. 65% of Chinese e-commerce platforms carry New Zealand goods. 59% of them prefer to carry, if they can, well-known New Zealand brands. So branding, again, as we've talked before, is important. And 41%, when asked, are looking for a more exclusive distribution particularly for those new products. So in terms of consumer research, you know, for a long time we've used surveys, and you can do those through the internet very easily. Increasingly people have market research online communities that you can access and almost you can get right into those homes and start to understand what they're doing and why they're doing that. And increasingly quite sophisticated mechanisms to analyse social media. So that whole online purchase understanding of consumers is going to be it's important now. Many companies putting a lot of effort in that space in terms of communicating with their consumers directly, building that loyalty and getting that feedback in terms of what they're getting. You also told us something that, you know, I'm repeating a lot of what Bill and Caroline was just saying now. Trust of food is really important, and for New Zealand companies, they recognise that that's the baseline. So it's around, for us, it's about the political environment in our society. It's the clean, green environment, though increasingly we're having competition from Europe in that, and there are some companies that are starting to take New Zealand off their brands. And also, it's more than just New Zealand. It's actually about our companies, our businesses, and our supply chains, and their ability to have that really in a very robust way. Taste is paramount. I don't think anyone is going to deny that. And food safety, it's probably started the growth of our products associated with a lack of trust in local products, but also that increasing worry around pollution. And so I think some of those early ideas that we had as scientists to look at work in immunity around pollution and how we can protect from pollution are probably really important spaces. The other thing that we wanted to do was to move into the consumer science and literature review to understand what's happening in New Zealand. There's a whole load of work going on, particularly in universities, that actually go out a lot broader than China. And I know that there have been some conversations around what's broader than China. I think that that is one of the things that we have to watch for and make sure that we're collecting that, and we have put funding aside to try and help us gather that into us. I think we also wanted to highlight there is some work, and there's some work done at Auckland University by Jenny Young, and some of you might have heard her speak. There is some important developments in terms of the science in New Zealand, in terms of understanding how we should communicate these product opportunities. And Jenny has been doing some work on obesity and understanding what consumers believe. And consumer beliefs can be quite complicated. They inform us how we should communicate with those consumers. And around obesity and some of the product concepts that Jenny put up, consumers were quite sceptical of the likelihood that those products would actually help them, but they had a level of hope that those products would deliver, and therefore they were going to go out. And as we understand more and more of how consumers build these, it's going to become more important for us. There's obviously, and the review of the Chinese literature we did for, as I said, to try and understand what's happening in China with the Chinese consumer scientists. China is at a point where they're starting to invest heavily in sensory science and product development type capabilities. They don't have the sort of development that we would expect in the West in companies like Nestle and a lot of the academic organizations around understanding the social science and consumer science. And when we looked at that literature, we sort of confirmed that. You found a lot of work that was going on around the different types of diet and how those might change in the future and what health risks were around there, but not much that I would have thought of as your core consumer science. So building on that knowledge of what the industry already knows, we've started to pull together, or we have developed a program, and I want to just quickly go through some of the things and focuses that we have in that work. And one of the first one is what does health and wellness mean? And we think to really understand this, you have to really get in with the consumers. You know, we know that consumers often lie when you ask them questions, that, you know, and we want to understand more about their emotional responses to food, because we know that even in terms of health and wellness, it's the emotions that actually sell the product. We want to understand their life events and their sense of those life events and why they're suddenly going to change towards eating those foods. We also have an issue. We realise that one of the key things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to convince consumers to eat some of those foods. And it's around communication, and it's around the communication of what are the cues to action that make someone change or decide that they need to change what they're eating. And this is a core platform of how we understand we as New Zealand companies can communicate with those consumers. And we've put a lot of focus around social media with that, and with the help of Andrew Zhu for Trace Research, we're going to pull out a lot of that social media. It's an area that's really quite important. It's around how can we convert intentions to actions. And it's quite easy to do a consumer project to measure whether people think they should change or whether they intend to change. It's far harder to understand what's actually going to make them change. And we've looked, there's a whole load of consumer models that are, behavioural models that we reviewed. One that I think is really interesting to look at is the compliant behaviour model. As in all of society, again, salience and mindfulness and the fact that people keep it in their minds that they should be eating healthy is a very big driver of that. But where we found some really interesting things coming from the US market, actually, in some of these models was in the pharmaceutical industry. And, non-compliant behaviour with pharmaceuticals is quite important. They reckon that it's some quite old data. You would imagine that if you were diagnosed with an illness and given something to make you better, you would probably take that. In fact, 125,000 people in the US died because they didn't take the medication that they were prescribed. So this issue of how you get compliance, how we actually get people to decide to change their food and continue eating that, is pretty important. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting out of that literature is in the pharmaceutical world, the fact that someone can look across and decide that they self-diagnose that they should have something to make them feel better or be better. Those were the people that were the least compliant. So in terms from a food perspective, there's a possibility, and I guess that it's easy for people to pick these foods up. It's also easy for them to drop them. And where we want to go with that is we want to, lastly, go back and we really need to understand our consumers, what they are in the future. And I've put up this diagram from Klaus Grunert's food-related behaviour. It sort of looks like an obvious chain of how people make decisions and how they go out and purchase and cook food. But more importantly, when you look in detail, it's looking at ways of shopping. There are people that actually go out and enjoy shopping and therefore they will spend more. So there's an emotional component with that. There are people that hate shopping and will do it in a different way. And so we have to look at that diagram and think in terms of the emotional as well as the physical tasks that are involved with those sorts of things. And so where have I got to? I forgot that I had a summary to give. So, China is obviously a really big opportunity. Our program, we hope, is set to stimulate innovation in the future. We're looking at pre-competitive work that will hopefully be a place that we can pull a whole load of things together to discuss quite broadly. It won't be necessarily very product specific. And right through those projects that we've run, we've realised there's an awful lot of stuff coming out of New Zealand that we have to find a way of pulling together in a way that can be packaged in a way that industry can access easily. Thank you.